So we've heard a great deal today about, actually from both sides of the aisle, pointing fingers across the way to the opposing party, about the issue of children, taking care of children that are brought here illegally, taking care of children that supposedly come here on their own. But since we know that nobody crosses from Mexico into the United States illegally without having the permission of the drug cartel that controls that section of the Mexico-U.S. border. So it's not really accurate to say a child comes unaccompanied, because a child can't cross Mexico by him or herself. A child is brought by somebody. Unfortunately, as we know, the figures from both government groups, Doctors Without Borders, and others, are pretty staggering when you realize that such a large percentage, 25%, 30% of girls that come to the United States through Mexico are raped. Seen too many rape trees, and it breaks my heart. It's just, as the poet said, incredible, the inhumanity to man. It is staggering. And sometimes it's difficult to tell people no that want to come here, but there's not a country in the world that lets more people into that country than the United States does. There is nowhere. Countries that are much bigger geographically, countries that have many more people, countries that have more space per person. There's no country that is as generous with the right being given to come in to a country legally as the United States does. And I love that about our country. But it is important to have rules about who gets to come in. Obviously, some have projected there may be 1.5 billion people that would like to come to the United States. If the 350 million or so people here were to have 1 billion people come in, obviously this country would cease to exist as it has or is or could be. It would cease to exist. It would become a third world country. There would be so much massive unemployment, overwhelming the social services. Disease would become rampant as we see people coming here from other countries. There's diseases that we have completely eliminated here in the United States that are now being reintroduced to the United States because we have not enforced our borders and made sure that people coming in, as welcome as they are to come in legally, that they're not coming in with a disease that puts people in the United States in jeopardy. Because once you do that, then you don't continue to be that light on the hill that so many want to come to. There is no place left. And last year, there were some people here who said, well, you know, if we keep losing more and more of our freedom here in the United States, maybe we just can all go to Australia. And I had a few guys that I met with from Australia. I thought they would find that amusing, but they didn't smile, they didn't laugh, and they said, do you not understand? If you lose your freedom here in America, China will take us over in a heartbeat. There will be no place you're going to be able to go. The United States of America is the place that gives everyone else in the world hope for freedom. I ran into the same thing in Nigeria. People imploring, in fact, some West Africans, they were Christians, and they wanted to meet with me before I left. And the oldest gentleman said, you know, we wanted to make sure before you went back to Washington you understood. We were also thrilled when you elected your first black president, but since President Obama has been the leader in the United States, we have seen America get weaker and weaker, and you've got to make sure people in Washington understand when America gets weaker, we suffer. Ebenezer was his name. He said, we know where we're going when we die. We are Christians, we're believers, but our only chance of having some degree of safety in this life is if America is strong. Unfortunately, as I heard from people there, as I read since, the Obama administration was putting requirements. Look, we'll give you more help in neutralizing Boko Haram, but you're going to have to legalize abortion, start paying for those, and you got to legalize same-sex marriage, and then we'll give you some serious help with Boko Haram. In the meantime, the administration had a hashtag, Bring Back Our Girls. That really didn't do much. Actually, it didn't do anything, really. Hashtag went around and around, but thank God for people that stepped up like our government did not, and actually helped girls, and some continue to be helped. Won't talk about where they are, how well they're doing, but just really tragic when the United States government that so many people around the world look to for hope, look to as an example of what perhaps their country could be someday, start losing hope when they see what happens here. It is tragic. And I know some, that we've seen this over the years, where there's Dr. Spock's books on how to raise children, don't ever say no. You might hurt their pride or enthusiasm, don't ever punish, just encourage. But the fact is, the reason we have laws that don't allow children to enter into binding contracts is because we understand that children can be too easily persuaded. That's why criminals are able to dangle candy or in some way entice children into situations wherein their lives are destroyed. There is a time to say no out of love and caring. I don't know anybody on either side of the aisle here, either party, that wants to see children harmed. But the fact is, as the Border Patrolmen tell me constantly, both when I'm down there all night or when I'm up here and hear from them, when you guys make it sound like anybody is welcome, especially if they have a child in their group, well, we have more children now coming, often to their own detriment, than we've ever had in our history. So I understand the feeling, let's don't say no to any child that wants to come into America, accompanied, unaccompanied. We extend our arms, but what happens, we know every time caravans, groups are coming in, big, small, people die trying to get in. The drug cartels are so corrupt, they will utilize children. They have no problem at taking young girls and using them in sex trafficking. And by our leaving that open, I hear it all the time from people that work the border, you guys lured them up here to their own harm. If you would just secure the border, these folks will quit coming. And you won't have thousands of girls being raped. You won't have people being sold into sex slavery. And I say sold, but it sounds more like, from the stories we get down there, that what happens, and it's not on the list of questions the Border Patrolmen ask as they're in processing people, but sometimes it's asked. how much did you have to pay? And sometimes they'll say the gang or the drug cartel to get you in here illegally. And the answer normally is $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. And again, the question's not on their list to ask, but when they ask, how did you get that money? You don't have that kind of money. Where would you come up with that kind of money? So often the answer is, well, we got 1,000 here. We had 1,000 sent, 1,500 sent from people in the United States. And they're going to let us work the rest off when we get where we're going. So many are not sold into slavery. They just agree without realizing they're about to become an indentured servant to a drug cartel. And they're going to be a servant either in sex trafficking or drug trafficking. And so often, I mean, I've stood there and watched people waiting to be processed, and they'll have an address in a city in the U.S., and I've seen them different times exchange, and they would switch cities. And then they would tell the Border Patrolman, here's the city where I have relatives, where I can go and be taken care of. And it's where the drug cartels told them to go. So technically they're not sold into slavery, but they've agreed to be indentured servants to the drug cartels. So it's amazing how many people seem shocked when they read story after story of how the drug cartels in Mexico have big operations in cities all over America. And that's why the Border Patrolmen say, you know what the drug cartels call us? They call us their logistics, like the commercial. Yeah, like the commercial. They get them across the border, and then the U.S. government ships these people wherever the drug cartels want them to go. And right now, they are so overwhelmed on our border. It's just tragic. And I know there are Christian groups receive millions of dollars for going down and helping get people in and taking care of them. And it sure makes it appear like they're scared of losing the millions of dollars they get for assisting illegal aliens. But we need to be realistic. And there is, when you're in a country that is self-governing, where you have an obligation as part of the government, if you're a citizen serving on juries, that makes you a judge of the facts of a case, or running for office, or voting. You vote because you're supposed to be the ones that hire the servants that come to work in the county seat, the state capitol, federal capitol. But the people are supposed to be the real rulers, and those of us elected are supposed to be the servants. But there's an obligation that goes with the freedoms. And that obligation means you've got to enforce the law across the board. Some people quote scripture saying, you know, we got to be good to the foreigners. True. We have got to help the widows and orphans. True. We ought to be encouraging and embracing of families. True. But when you're acting as the government, you have a different role. And that is a role to ensure that the law is enforced evenly and fairly across the board without regard of someone's financial situation, social status, or anything else. And that's why there are verses in the Bible that, you know, something to pray for is people who will not show favoritism to the rich, and also verses say, and not show favoritism to the poor. You treat everyone fairly across the board. I'm sure got a lot of hateful things when I was a judge, and I revoked the probation of a daughter of one of the wealthy oil families in my hometown. They even had many of my supporters in the courtroom thinking that would intimidate me from doing what I would have done to anyone else. But as a judge, that's the job. You don't show favoritism to people because of their wealth or because of their lack of it. You enforce the laws fairly across the board. And just as it would be crazy for a parent to welcome a child who can't swim to come jump in the pool, you would say, no, that's dangerous. No, don't touch the hot stove. No, don't stick anything into the electric socket. There is a time to say no. But some think that being loving and caring means never to say no. There is a time to say no. And if we enforced our borders and do so fairly and are fair about the over 1 million visas that we give out in this country, again, the most generous of any country in the world, just do so fairly. And then you don't have people forced into sex trafficking, forced into drug trafficking. You know, the best, most compassionate thing we could say or do to help people in Mexico would be to totally secure the border so only people come in that are legally coming in, and to shut down the money that the drug cartels are making off the drug trafficking and the sex trafficking. Because according to some estimates, before they started getting so much money from human trafficking, they estimated 80 billion, one source, 80 billion or so from drug trafficking. But then what an incredible business model. They're making all this money off drugs, but they don't have to hire employees because the employees come to them and pay them a fee to help them get to a place where they can sell the drugs for them at no charge to the drug cartels. And don't think the drug cartels don't know how to say no and take lives. They know how to cut heads off and put them on pikes to intimidate people, to keep them in line. There's nothing more difficult in Mexico than being a law enforcement officer who is dedicated to truly enforcing the law fairly, including against people in the drug cartels. Their lives are at great risk, as are their families. But if we secure the border, build a wall where we need it, secure the border, then the money dries up to pay for corruption in Mexico. Mexico, you think about Mexico, they ought to be a top 10 economy. They have incredible natural resources. They've got a better location than North America. They're between North and South America. They're between the two oceans. They ought to be the greatest trader with all the natural resources. And of course, they've got some of the hardest working people in the world. Why are they not a top 10 economy? Because of corruption. How is corruption funded? Money coming across our border illegally for drugs that come in illegally, for sex trafficking coming in. What an incredible gift to the people of Mexico, so many of whom dream of a day when they could have an incredibly vibrant economy and they didn't have to worry about corrupt police or corrupt government officials. And that's why I know when you hear some Mexican elected official say they don't want the border secured, then you can pretty well take it to the bank. They're taking money to the bank from the drug cartels. Otherwise, they would want to see Mexico reach its potential that cannot be reached as long as we're allowing tens of billions of dollars to flow from the United States to the drug cartels for the corruption of government and the harm to people. Now, there used to be an unwritten rule, as I understood it, that the drug cartels would not kill anybody, rob. They would not let crime go on around the Mexico's resorts. But that's certainly gone through the wayside. My wife and I went to our honeymoon in Mexico. We celebrate our 25th anniversary in Mexico. But as a government official, going to Mexico with people, cartels knowing who I am, it's a dangerous place to go now. And so we hadn't been back in a long time. I look forward to the day when we can. And that day will be when we secure our border and Mexico achieves the status in the world's economies that it should because of what's there and the people. That would be a gift we should give them. But in the meantime, if we make clear we are securing our border, you're not coming in unless you come in through a port of entry, a legal port of entry, and you come in legally. You're not coming in. Now we hear the stories, we read the stories, get the accounts. Children are now a commodity because the drug cartels know if somebody comes in with a child with them or with their group, oh, gee, this is a big family. And so we saw all of the wild screaming and gnashing of teeth over children not being with parents. And so they know they're not going to be separated and they're going to be able to stay in the country, so they're coming. They're coming in greater numbers than ever before. You look back at some of the numbers from the 90s, it was 80%, as I recall, and somebody was just referring to the numbers recently, about 80% were single adults from Mexico, men, who were coming for jobs. And now, because of the dramatization over what happens every day in every county in the country, and that is a child who has committed a crime or is arrested for committed a crime being separated from a child, happens every day. I used to sign warrants to arrest people, and they certainly didn't bring the children to the jail with them. They were separated from their children. It's what happens when a government is trying to be fair and not make the children suffer or be punished for the sins of the parent. That's what a caring society would do. You don't punish the children for the wrongs of the parent. But now, children are a commodity. They're being rented, purchased, and used in order to better ensure that people coming in illegally will be able to stay here. And I did vote against my own party's motion to recommit. That's not the way that kind of spending should be done. $2 billion will end up luring people again to this country. We advertise and people will know, the drug cartels will use it. Look, they just voted through a provision that will provide $2-3 billion for medication for people that come into the country illegally. That's not something we should be playing a game with. That's why I voted no. This is too serious to be taken lightly. So we shouldn't be playing politics with things like that. Let's secure the border and take care of folks that are here and ensure that people that come into this country do so legally. And I'm actually... I asked the question to Secretary Nielsen when she was at Homeland Security this year. I asked her, what if we were to have immigration judges, not in an interior courtroom somewhere across America, but had immigration judges there at the border, And even if we had to just set up big tents, have the immigration judges at the border, she said that would solve the problem. You wouldn't have to give somebody a notice to come back for a hearing 4 years from now to determine whether they can stay in the country legally or not, and for which most people never come back for their hearing. So I'm hopeful that at some point President Trump will say, you know what, let's don't set hearings years off. And in fact, Secretary Nielsen, as I recall, indicated if someone is kept there at a facility near the border, they normally have a hearing 90 to 100 days, 120 days from when they are picked up. But if they are released on some kind of recognizance or bond, it's, years on average before they have their hearing. Well, let's solve that. Let's just send our immigration judges to the border. You come across and claim asylum, let's have your hearing today. And we'll know by tonight whether you get to stay or whether we're taking you and back across. But it doesn't do much good to, quote, deport, unquote, someone who's here illegally if you don't secure the border. And that's why a guy that ended up in my felony courtroom had 9 DWIs, didn't speak English, and he finally came to my felony court after normally a third DWI gets charged as a felony, but somehow he had gotten by. And on the 9th DWI, he was driving while intoxicated. He ended up causing an accident, nearly killed some folks, did serious damage. But I figure if he had 9 DWIs, this guy is a threat to the safety of everybody in this country. Everybody legally and illegally in this country is at risk if this guy's here and out and driving. So I went ahead and sent him to prison. 9 DWIs is far too many, especially when you start doing serious bodily injury to people. And I was shocked that within 6 months he was back in my courtroom. He was driving drunk, hurt somebody else. And through the interpreter, I asked him, how is he back here in my courtroom? I sent him to prison. And he said, well, about 3 months after he went he didn't even, at that time it was not even 3 months, maybe been a month. He was picked up and deported. They carried him to the border, and through the interpreter he explained, they made him walk across the border. And I said, so how are you back here? He said, I waited till the deportation officers drove off, and then he came back across the border as soon as they left. And got back to drinking and driving and ended up back in my courtroom. So this time, I thought, well, if he's going to be here, obviously he's an alcoholic. So I sent him to a substance abuse felony punishment facility because everybody there is either an alcoholic or drug addict. They go through a 12-step program. And I figured, well, if he's going to be in the country, for heaven's sake, he at least needs to be clean and sober. And I got word that at that facility, he was there about 90 days before he was deported. And I would imagine he's came back in the country somewhere, but obviously not back to my county. So why wouldn't we enforce our borders? A country that has no borders or that has borders that are not enforced, it's not a country. It's not definable. It's just kind of an area where people go. And if we are going to continue to be a shining light for so many countries and so many people around the world, we need to follow the law, not show favoritism, not to people because they're poor, not to people because they're rich. but to be fair and enforce the laws across the board. And that brings me to an important point that's been in the news a great deal lately, and actually it's been going on for some time. This country, regardless of how many people may want to rewrite history, was largely inhabited and founded by people who were Christians, different denominations, who were looking to have a place where they were not persecuted for being a Christian. And I know we're told, as Christian, we were going to suffer for Christ's sake. And I know Jesus said, remember when they hate you, they hated me first. But for whatever reason, we've been allowed to have a country, unlike most any place in history, where you were not persecuted for being a Christian. Now, there were different denominations that would have big controversies with other denominations. Some of that was playing out in the first 5 weeks of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And that's when Ben Franklin gave his famous speech. How do we know what he said? Well, Madison was taking notes, but afterwards, Franklin was asked for a copy of his speech. He sat down and wrote it out. Everybody that was there saw the speech, said, oh yeah, this is word for word, everything he said. And I know most children apparently in the country are taught that Ben Franklin was a deist, someone who believed that there was some force, some being, something that created the universe, and if that thing, being, force still exists anymore, it never interferes with the laws of nature or the activity of human beings. It never gets involved. And kids are being taught Ben Franklin was a deist. But he stood up, he's 82 years old, he's got gout, he's got advanced arthritis, he's overweight, he has trouble getting up and down the few steps into Independence Hall, has trouble getting up. He's got a cane, but often had to have help. And he hadn't really spoken to that point of the convention. One of the people at the convention wrote that President Washington, he wasn't president of the country, he was president of the Constitutional Convention, that President Washington looked relieved when Dr. Franklin sought recognition, because there was so much screaming going on. And no, Franklin didn't have an MD or a PhD, but he was certainly recognized as being worthy of being a doctor. But Franklin gets up, probably had help, and we know what he said because he wrote it down. And he starts about saying, we've been going on for nearly 5 weeks. We've got more no's than ayes on virtually every vote. And then this is his verbatim. He says, how has it happened, sir, that we have not thought of humbly seeking illumination from the source of all light? That's not verbatim, but close. He says, in the beginning contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. Then he goes on to point out that everybody in there should remember specific things that they prayed for as leaders in the Continental Congress during the Revolution, and that they should remember how specific things they prayed for were answered by God. And then back to verbatim, he says, I've lived, sir, a long time. He's a year or so away from meeting his maker. And he said, the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth. God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it possible an empire could rise without his aid? We've been assured, sir, in the sacred writing, he's talking about the Bible. We've been assured, sir, in the sacred writing that no empire is going to rise without his aid. And he says, we got a chance to create something special. These are not his verbatim words, but he said, if we take advantage of that and we come together, by the grace of God, we're going to have a special country. But then he adds, without God's grace, we're going to succeed no better than the builders of Babel. He said, we'll be confounded by our local partial interests, and we ourselves shall become a byword down through the ages. So he goes on and he ends up making a motion that, just like during the Revolution, just like with the Continental Congress, that the Constitutional Convention should start with prayer every day. And some point out, see, it was really a secular Congress because they voted that down. But if you go look at what the discussion was, there were a bunch of different denominations there. And usually the Quakers were most disagreeable about who they would approve for saying a prayer for the whole group. And as the debate pointed out, yes, during the Revolution, we had a treasury. We had money that we could hire a Christian chaplain to say the prayer every day for us. There wasn't anybody here that could say a prayer that everybody else in the convention would feel got a fair shake for their denomination, but we could agree on one chaplain, one minister that would say a fair prayer for everybody. And here we are at this convention. We're not getting paid. We don't have a treasury. So we're going to have to put off hiring a chaplain to do the prayer every day until we get this Constitution done. And that's why it didn't get approved. So then Randolph from Virginia gets up and he's okay. He understands. We don't have money to hire a chaplain to do the prayer every day. But here we are at the end of June. This is 1776. 1787. He said, it's the end of June. We're about to celebrate our nation's birthday. So we're not accomplishing anything. Why don't we recess here now and reconvene together in a church that we all agree on, Christian church, and we all go together there, and on our nation's birthday, we worship God together, and then we come back and try to work this Constitution thing out. That passed. And the delegates at the Constitutional Convention came together and worshiped on our nation's birthday at the Reformed Calvinistic Church in Philadelphia. Reverend William Rogers presiding as a minister. And I think you can even find online one of the prayers that he prayed for the convention. And as somebody wrote back then, when they came back together, there were differences, but there was a different spirit. And they were able to come together. And they were able to reach an agreement. There was such strong division among the most populous states. They said, we're the most populous states. We ought to have more representation. And others said, no, we can't come together unless we all have equal representation. The Great Compromise came together. Okay, we'll have two separate bodies within the Congress. We'll have one where states have representation based on the population, and we'll have another, and it won't be like the House of Lords where they really don't have any power. This will be a separate body. They have just as much power as the other house, but every state gets two representatives, and then we'll balance. That was the Great Compromise, and it would enable them to come together. There were great concerns about human rights and government's intrusion into people's private matters. They wanted to make sure that a king or a president couldn't just sign an order to go search somebody's home or take over a home or go gather up anything they wanted. So they agreed, okay, if we come together on this Constitution, then we also agree it must have a Bill of Rights that comes with it. And the first of the Bill of Rights that was approved, the first 10 amendments, they didn't want to have like a Church of England that was the official government church. They didn't want a government church. Of course, now we've got one. It's called, informally, the Church of Secularism. The Supreme Court has forced us into, because regardless of what anybody thinks, a government, and I used to say in college, you know, you can't legislate morality, and then eventually I've realized a government legislates somebody's morality, and it may be no morality, and we've kind of come to that. Moses' face is up there because at one time he was considered to be the greatest lawgiver of all time. You got Hammurabi, the Justinian Code started by Justin, Napoleon, Jefferson. Jefferson didn't help with the Constitution, but these are the great lawgivers considered as such. Got 2 or 3 popes up here, but Moses was supposed to be the great one. And in recent years, children are being taught, you know what, there's no real right or wrong. It's whatever you feel in your heart is wrong. And it's just, you know, it's all relative. Right and wrong is all relative. That's not what Moses said. And I was hearing Dennis Prager earlier today saying you cannot have a free country based on secularist beliefs, based on atheism. You can't. The only way you can have the level of freedom we've had is not requiring everybody to be a Christian, but to base the government on Judeo-Christian beliefs. And that's been our history. And we welcome people. We don't mind anybody having any religion or no religion. But the only way you can have that kind of freedom is to base it on Christian beliefs. I know visiting with General J. Garner that President Bush initially sent to Iraq to talk to people and get a feel from the Iraqis what kind of government they should have. And when he summarized, he talked to a direct descendant of Muhammad, and there were a lot of people with him. And after they left, General Garner said, "Did everybody hear what he said?" They all agreed they heard. There was a reporter there. He said, "Are you going to write that in a story?" He said, "No, nobody'd believe it. They'd think I was crazy." But this very devout Muslim, descendant of Muhammad, said, look, we need, in essence, in summary, we need a government that is based on a constitution that Iraqis write, and the government be composed of Iraqis, and the Constitution needs to be based on the teachings of Jesus. And General Garner said, you guys all hear that after he left? He said, yes, he said they need a constitution based on the teachings of Jesus. Devout Muslim descendant of Muhammad agreed, you really want a free society? Use the teachings of Jesus. And the founders knew that, just like the descendant of Muhammad. That's the best way to have a free country. But now we are seeing more and more the persecution of Christians. Now the UN General Secretary, back when he was in charge of all the refugee program, was asked about why there is not as high a percentage of Christians in the UN refugee program as there are percentage of Christians in the areas where refugees are coming from, like Syria. And he basically made the statement that Christians are so very important to those geographic areas that we think it's important to leave them where they are. They were being wiped out where they were. And the truth is, when Christians were coming to the UN refugee camps to be reassigned or sent elsewhere after that, they were often victims of violence. Read many reports, talked to people over in some of the refugee camps. The Christians didn't want to go there. They didn't like the way they were picked on. So you didn't find that many Christians in those camps. But here's an article from May 3rd. And this is from the BBC, because this stuff is not being reported properly by the mainstream media in America. The title is, Christians Are Most Persecuted Group. It says the persecution of Christians in parts of the world is at or near genocide levels, according to a report ordered by Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. That's Foreign Secretary in England. Christians were the most persecuted religious group, is what this study found. The interim report said the main impact of genocidal acts against Christians is exodus, and that Christianity faced being wiped out from parts of the Middle East. It warned the religion, quote, talking about Christianity, is at risk of disappearing, unquote, in parts of the world, pointing to figures which claim Christians in Palestine represent less than 1.5% of the population, while in Iraq they had fallen from 1.5 million before 2003 to less than 120,000. Quote, evidence shows not only the geographic spread of anti-Christian persecution, but also its increasing severity, unquote. Further down it says, quote, in some regions, the level and nature of persecution is arguably coming close to meeting the international definition of genocide, according to that adopted by the UN, unquote. Its findings come after more than 250 people were killed and more than 500 wounded in attacks at hotels and churches in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday. I mean, this is the kind of stuff going on. The article goes on, again, from the BBC. What we have forgotten in that atmosphere of political correctness is actually the Christians that are being persecuted are some of the poorest people on the planet. In response to the report, the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Marie van der Zyl, said Jews had often been the targets of persecution and felt for Christians who were discriminated against on the basis of their faith. Quote, whether it is in authoritarian regimes or bigotry masked in the mistaken guise of religion, reports like the one launched today remind us that there are many places in which Christians face appalling levels of violence, abuse, and harassment. Pretty tragic. But then here in the United States, this story from CBN News, May 7th this year, the Pacific Justice Institute announced Tuesday that a Bible study for elderly residents of the Veterans Home of California has been restored. The facility is owned and operated by the California Department of Veterans Affairs. The nonprofit PGI, Pacific Justice Institute, also says its attorneys will continue to fight for full restoration of religious freedom in the facility. After some negotiation, CalVet, that's California Department of Veterans Affairs, said it would allow Artist Bro and her Bible study attendees to resume the Bible study effective immediately after it had been shut down for weeks. However, CalVet, that's California Department of Veterans Affairs, continues to insist that it can investigate and substantiate allegations against Bro and her fellow residents for expressing religious views that it, the California Department of Veterans Affairs, believes offensive, and even for discussing heaven and salvation. Quote, "We are encouraged that CalVet realized it could no longer prohibit and threaten the Veterans Bible Study." PGI President Brad Dacus said in a press release, "At the time, the agency's position that it can continue to punish religious, and really it's Christian expression is specifically who CalVet is going after, Christian expression it deems discourteous or offenses is unacceptable. We've won an important first round in the battle for these heroes, the veterans, and we are committed to seeing this through to complete victory." PGI attorneys began representing Bro last fall when staff at the Veterans Home complained that she had committed emotional abuse and elder abuse by allegedly causing another resident to lose sleep after a discussion about heaven and hell. Last week, CalVet admitted the allegation was unsubstantiated. This past March, a CalVet attorney threatened to have Bro removed from the home if she did not immediately halt her longtime Bible study. Quote, "What we've seen at the Veterans Home of California should concern every freedom-loving America. Of all people, our veterans and their widows from the greatest generation should enjoy the greatest blessings of liberty, not the least. We're not about to let up until these veterans have complete freedom," unquote. It's from PGI attorneys. Anyway, it's just outrageous how wrong-headed people have gotten. And that's because they're imposing a court-ordered imposition of secularism. We've come to a point in political correctness where the only group that is politically correct to abuse, belittle, discriminate against are Christians. You don't have to like Christians, but for heaven's sake, that's the kind of freedom in allowing Christians to worship freely that made us the greatest country in history. And now we've got the Equality Act. Supposedly it's going to come up next week. But it is disturbing that people, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 was passed by a huge majority of Democrats in 1993 because they were concerned in 1993, some of them, including our current chairman of Judiciary, Jerry Nadler, they were concerned about the persecution for Christians and Jews. And they saw the need to have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. And back then, these same people believed that Moses, he knew what he was talking about. And when Jesus quoted Moses verbatim about marriage, then he knew what he was talking about. In fact, we knew that that still was true in 2008. From David Axelrod's book, they knew that Barack Obama could not win the presidency if he said marriage was the same sex, that was fine. That marriage, it was not sufficient to say you could have same-sex relationships. That was fine, but marriage is what the Bible said, a man and a woman. But apparently, they had polled it every which way, and in 2008, if you thought marriage was something besides what Moses believed and that Jesus said, as he quoted Moses verbatim, then you couldn't get elected president. Now, if you say, I still think what Moses and Jesus said is what marriage ought to be. You know, same-sex relations are one thing, but marriage, historically, except perhaps during the days of Moses, my understanding is even in Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously same-sex relationships were fine, but even there, marriage was for procreation, therefore it was a man and woman. Now you say that, and you're to be persecuted, you're to be destroyed for believing Moses and Jesus knew what they were talking about. But some of those same people that rammed through the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 have now added this provision that Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 shall not provide a claim or a defense to a claim under this bill, and it sets up anyone. I mean, there's even a provision here, you can have a claim filed against a bank, lending institution, if they don't lend money to someone who is gender confused. That's what gender dysphoria is. That's what the DSM-5 calls it, gender dysphoria, like the opposite of euphoria. It's confusion about one's gender. Biological gender may disagree with what they feel like that day. And we're seeing the great gains made by women and women's sports. If this becomes law, that will be destroyed. You'll have men's sports and you'll have co-ed sports. And as a lady who was one of the first to ever benefit by having a women's scholarship from Villanova said when she's a PhD testified, look, you've got thousands of men who can beat the best time in the world for women's 400 meter in 2016 Olympics. Women won't be the ones getting the scholarships anymore if this Equality Act becomes law. Martina Navratilova, you know, she makes no bones about being a lesbian, and she has been basically destroyed in social media for saying a woman should not have to compete with a biological man. It's unfair. And we had a lady tells us she was a lesbian testifying, look, women's sports are going to be destroyed if you pass this bill. All the great gains made for women being treated fairly and equally are going to go by the wayside. And I know from my days as a judge, you know, hearing the tragic stories of sexual assault, aggravated sexual assault, that women suffer a greater percentage of post-traumatic stress disorder than soldiers do if they've been sexually assaulted. And one of the things that can trigger the trauma, again, is being in a confined space and a man comes in. But the response from the majority is, well, they just basically need to get over it because we don't want to hurt the man's feelings if he thinks he's a woman. I hope this doesn't pass. I hope it doesn't become law. There's some great things in here for equality, but that's not one of them. I yield back.